May 1945. Nazi Germany had surrendered. Across America, families celebrated. The war in Europe was finally over. But for more than 5,000 American prisoners of war, freedom never came. They had survived Hitler's camps. They had endured starvation, beatings, and years behind barbed wire. Then Soviet forces arrived. Liberation had finally come, or so they thought. Instead, they were marched east, far away from home, far away from American lines, and straight into the hands of Joseph Stalin. When reports reached General George Patton that thousands of American soldiers were allegedly being held inside Soviet-controlled territory, he exploded with rage. Diplomats urged patience. Washington demanded caution. But Patton believed one thing: no American soldier should be abandoned. What happened next would bring American tanks face-to-face with Soviet forces, trigger one of the most dangerous confrontations of the post-war era, and reveal a conflict that many historians still debate today. And before this story ends, you'll discover why some believe Patton paid the ultimate price for refusing to back down. Before we uncover what Patton did next, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoy untold World War II stories, hidden military operations, and shocking historical confrontations, you're in the right place. Now let's see how one report from a former POW pushed Patton toward a showdown that could have changed history forever. The guns had finally fallen silent across Europe. German cities lay in ruins. Millions celebrated the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history. For most Allied soldiers, the nightmare was over. But inside a military headquarters in Bavaria, a single report was about to shatter that illusion. General George S. Patton sat behind his desk reviewing post-war intelligence summaries when an exhausted American officer was escorted into the room. The man looked terrible. His uniform hung loosely from his thin frame. His face was covered in dirt and weeks of beard growth. His eyes showed the look of someone who had seen too much. His name was Captain Robert Shaw, and what he told Patton would change everything. Only weeks earlier, Shaw had been a prisoner in a German POW camp. When Soviet troops liberated the camp, he believed freedom had finally arrived. Instead, Soviet guards ordered the Americans into columns and marched them east, not west toward American lines, east, deeper into Soviet-controlled territory. At first, nobody questioned it. The war was ending. Confusion was everywhere. Transportation networks were shattered. Soldiers assumed they were simply being processed before returning home. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The Americans remained behind barbed wire. New guards, new flags, same prison. Shaw described thousands of American prisoners being held in camps across Soviet-controlled territory. Every time they asked when they would be released, Soviet officers gave the same answer: soon. But soon never came. Eventually, Shaw escaped under cover of darkness and spent days moving west through forests and ruined villages until he finally reached American lines. Now he stood before Patton, and Patton listened in complete silence. When the captain finished speaking, the room was still. Patton slowly rose from his chair. "How many?" he asked. "Sir, at least several thousand." The general's jaw tightened. Several thousand American soldiers. Men who had survived Hitler. Men whose families believed they were already coming home. Men who were now allegedly trapped behind another line of barbed wire. Patton walked toward a large map hanging on the wall. His eyes fixed on the growing Soviet occupation zone stretching across Eastern Europe. Something about this didn't feel like a mistake. It felt deliberate. And if Stalin was intentionally holding American prisoners, Patton knew diplomacy alone might not solve the problem. The war against Germany had ended, but another confrontation was beginning, one that could place two former allies on a collision course. And before long, Patton would demand answers that Moscow had no intention of giving. Patton ordered his intelligence officers to investigate every claim made by Captain Shaw. The results were disturbing. Reports began arriving from multiple sources. Escaped prisoners told nearly identical stories. Reconnaissance teams identified camps inside Soviet-controlled territory. Military records showed thousands of American soldiers had been liberated by Soviet forces, but never officially returned. The numbers kept growing. 1,000, 3,000, 5,000. By mid-June, intelligence officers believed more than 5,000 American POWs could still be missing. Patton was furious. These weren't anonymous names on paper. They were American soldiers, men who had fought through France, Belgium, and Germany, men whose families were waiting at home, men who had already suffered enough. Patton immediately sent the evidence up the chain of command. The information reached Supreme Allied Headquarters, where General Dwight Eisenhower reviewed the reports. The request was simple: ask Moscow for answers. Surely there had been a misunderstanding. Surely the Soviets would cooperate. After all, the United States and the Soviet Union had fought together against Nazi Germany. At least that was the hope. A formal message was sent to Soviet leadership requesting clarification regarding the missing American prisoners. Everyone expected a routine response. Instead, the answer stunned them. The Soviet government denied everything. According to Moscow, there were no American prisoners being held. None. The camps didn't exist. The reports were false. The witnesses were mistaken. The missing soldiers had either already been released or could not be located. Patton could hardly believe what he was reading. He slammed the document onto his desk. "We have names," he growled. "We have eyewitnesses. We have escaped prisoners standing in front of us." Yet Stalin's government was acting as if those men had vanished into thin air. To Patton, the message was clear. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't bureaucracy. It was a deliberate refusal. The situation quickly became dangerous. Many Allied leaders wanted patience. They feared that openly challenging Stalin could destroy the fragile alliance that had just won World War II. The Soviet Union controlled huge portions of Eastern Europe. Millions of Soviet troops remained under arms. Nobody wanted another conflict. But Patton saw things differently. Every day spent negotiating meant another day thousands of American soldiers remained trapped behind Soviet lines. And he was running out of patience. Late one evening, Patton stood staring at a large map of Europe. His finger traced the border separating American and Soviet occupation zones. Then he made a decision. If diplomacy wasn't working, he would find another way to get Stalin's attention. A way the Soviet leader would not be able to ignore. And soon, American tanks would begin moving east. June 1945. The war was over. But inside General Patton's headquarters, the mood felt anything but peaceful. For weeks, reports had piled up on his desk. Missing American prisoners, eyewitness accounts, Soviet denials, broken promises. And now, according to intelligence estimates, thousands of Americans were still trapped somewhere behind Soviet-controlled lines. Patton had reached his limit. If Stalin refused to answer diplomatic messages, Patton intended to send a message of his own. The next morning, senior officers gathered around a large operations map. Patton pointed toward the border separating the American and Soviet occupation zones. "I want armored units moved east." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. American tanks approaching Soviet positions. Only weeks after the Allies had defeated Germany together. One officer finally spoke. "Sir, Moscow may see that as a threat." Patton didn't hesitate. "Good." Within days, columns of American armor began rolling toward the frontier. Sherman tanks, artillery batteries, thousands of battle-hardened soldiers. Officially, it was only a routine redeployment. Unofficially, everyone knew exactly what it was. Pressure, a warning, a signal to Stalin that patience was running out. When Soviet observers spotted the movement, alarm spread quickly. Reports rushed through military headquarters. American forces were gathering, large numbers, close to the border. For the first time since Germany's surrender, the possibility of a direct confrontation between the world's two most powerful armies suddenly felt real. Neither side fired a shot, but both sides prepared. American crews loaded ammunition. Soviet tank units increased patrols. Reconnaissance aircraft filled the skies. The atmosphere grew tense by the hour. Many officers feared a single mistake could trigger a disaster. One nervous soldier later described the situation perfectly. It felt like the war had ended on paper, but not in reality. Meanwhile, Patton refused to back down. Every morning he demanded updates. Every evening he reviewed intelligence reports. And every day the tanks remained exactly where they were. Waiting, watching, sending a message visible across the border. The pressure was beginning to work. Soviet commanders who had ignored diplomatic requests suddenly became far more interested in discussions. Meetings were scheduled. Messages were exchanged. Questions were asked. For the first time, Moscow appeared willing to talk. But Patton wasn't celebrating yet. Talk was cheap. His men were still missing. And until they started coming home, the tanks would stay exactly where they were. The showdown had begun. What happened next would shock both Washington and Moscow, and force Stalin to make a decision he never expected to face. Tension spread across Europe. Washington grew nervous. British commanders grew nervous. Even some of Patton's own officers worried that the situation was spiraling out of control. One misunderstanding, one nervous soldier, one accidental shot. That was all it would take. Yet Patton refused to pull back. His message was simple: bring the Americans home. Then, after weeks of silence, something unexpected happened. A communication arrived from Soviet authorities. The tone had changed completely. Gone were the outright denials. Gone were the claims that no prisoners existed. Instead, Soviet officials suddenly acknowledged that a number of American personnel had been temporarily detained during post-war processing operations. Patton nearly laughed when he heard the explanation. For weeks, Moscow had insisted there were no prisoners. Now they were admitting some had been held all along. It was exactly the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Negotiations intensified immediately. Military representatives met behind closed doors. Lists of names were exchanged. Transportation routes were discussed. And then came the moment thousands of families had been praying for. The first convoy appeared. American trucks rolled toward a designated transfer point near the occupation boundary. Waiting on the opposite side were exhausted men wearing faded uniforms. Many looked far older than their actual age. Some limped, others needed help walking. But every one of them was finally heading home. As the first group crossed into American-controlled territory, soldiers lining the road erupted in cheers. Some of the returning prisoners broke down in tears. Others simply stood in silence, unable to believe the ordeal was finally ending. Word spread rapidly through military headquarters. The prisoners were coming back. Not hundreds, thousands. Day after day, additional groups arrived. Medical teams worked around the clock. Families were notified. Names once listed as missing suddenly became living men again. For Patton, it was proof that pressure had worked. Without it, he believed those prisoners might have remained forgotten. But even as celebrations began, troubling questions remained unanswered. Why had the Soviets held them in the first place? How many prisoners had never been identified? And what other secrets existed behind the Iron Curtain that was beginning to descend across Eastern Europe? Patton suspected this was only the beginning. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was cracking apart. The distrust was growing. And the Soviet Union had shown a side of itself that Patton would never forget. What he did next would place him on a direct collision course not only with Stalin, but with powerful people inside his own government as well. The return of the prisoners should have been a victory. And for thousands of American families, it was. But for General Patton, the battle was far from over. The more he learned about Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe, the more concerned he became. Cities that had been liberated from Nazi control were now falling under Soviet domination. Political opponents were disappearing. Local governments were being pressured, and Soviet troops remained stationed across vast regions of Europe. Patton saw a pattern emerging. To him, the war had not truly ended. The enemy had simply changed. During meetings with fellow officers, Patton spoke openly about his concerns. Sometimes too openly. He criticized Soviet actions. He questioned American policy. And he warned that trusting Stalin could prove to be a terrible mistake. Many people agreed with him privately. Few were willing to say so publicly. Washington was trying to maintain peace with Moscow. The United States had just emerged from the most destructive war in history. The last thing political leaders wanted was another confrontation. Patton, however, wasn't known for remaining silent. Reporters began hearing rumors of his comments. Military officials started receiving complaints. Diplomats worried his statements could damage negotiations with the Soviets. Soon, Patton's words were creating headlines. Some praised him as a patriot willing to speak the truth. Others accused him of recklessness. The controversy grew larger every week. Then came a series of meetings with senior Allied commanders. Patton argued that Stalin's government could not be trusted. He warned that Europe was heading toward another conflict if Soviet expansion continued unchecked. Several officials urged caution. Others told him directly to stop making public remarks. Patton refused. He believed history would prove him right. The more pressure he received, the more determined he became. But his growing criticism came at a cost. Powerful figures inside Washington were becoming frustrated. Some believed Patton was undermining official policy. Others feared he might provoke a crisis with the Soviet Union. Behind closed doors, discussions began about limiting his influence, reassigning him, silencing him, removing him from positions where his words could cause problems. Patton sensed the shift immediately. The celebrated wartime hero who had led armies across Europe was suddenly finding himself isolated. Yet he remained defiant. "If people don't want the truth," he reportedly told friends, "that doesn't change what the truth is." What Patton didn't know was that events were already moving against him. And within months, a shocking tragedy would spark questions, rumors, and debates that would continue for decades. Questions that many people still ask today. Was it simply an accident? Or had one of America's most outspoken generals become too dangerous to ignore? By late 1945, General Patton's position had changed dramatically. Only months earlier, he had been one of America's greatest war heroes. Now he found himself increasingly isolated. His outspoken criticism of Soviet policies had made powerful people uncomfortable. His blunt opinions continued to attract controversy. Yet Patton remained convinced he was right. Then, on December 9, 1945, everything changed. That afternoon, Patton was traveling near Mannheim, Germany. The roads were quiet. The war was over. There was no battlefield danger. No enemiambus. No active combat. Then suddenly, a military truck entered the roadway. Moments later, a collision occurred. The impact wasn't catastrophic. Several people inside the vehicles escaped with relatively minor injuries. But Patton suffered severe trauma to his neck and spine. The famous general who had survived years of war was left paralyzed. News of the accident spread rapidly around the world. Millions were stunned. How could a man who had survived North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany be brought down in a peacetime traffic accident? Patton was transferred to a hospital. Doctors worked tirelessly to save him. Friends and family hoped for recovery. For several days, there appeared to be reason for optimism. Patton remained conscious. He spoke with visitors. He discussed future plans. Some believed he might eventually recover enough to return home. Then his condition suddenly worsened. On December 21, 1945, just 12 days after the crash, George Patton died. Officially, the cause was complications resulting from his injuries. The military treated the case as a tragic accident. For many people, that explanation was enough, but not everyone accepted it. Almost immediately, rumors began circulating. Some pointed to Patton's growing criticism of Soviet policies. Others noted his repeated warnings about Stalin. A few questioned whether the collision had truly been accidental. No credible evidence ever proved a conspiracy. No investigation uncovered a plot. Yet the timing fueled endless speculation. The outspoken general who had challenged powerful enemies was suddenly gone. Over the decades, books, documentaries, and researchers would revisit the mystery again and again. Most historians continue to view the incident as a tragic accident. Others remain unconvinced. What nobody disputes is this: Patton died believing the Soviet Union posed a serious threat to the future of Europe. And in the years that followed, as the Cold War emerged and the Iron Curtain descended across the continent, many people wondered whether his warnings had been ahead of their time. But Patton's story wasn't ending with his death. In many ways, it was only beginning. George Patton never lived to see the Cold War. He never witnessed the Berlin blockade. He never saw the Iron Curtain divide Europe. He never watched the decades-long struggle between East and West that would define the second half of the 20th century. But many believe he saw the first signs before almost anyone else. In the months following his death, Europe changed rapidly. Soviet influence expanded across Eastern Europe. Nations that had hoped for freedom found themselves under Moscow's control. The alliance that had defeated Hitler slowly dissolved into suspicion, rivalry, and fear. The Cold War had begun. As the years passed, historians continued debating Patton's views. Some argued he was too aggressive. Others believed he understood the threat earlier than most political leaders. Regardless of where people stand, one fact remains undeniable: Patton never backed down from what he believed. Whether facing German armies, political pressure, or Soviet power, he spoke his mind with a bluntness that often shocked those around him. That same determination is why stories about him continue to fascinate people today. And it is why the controversy surrounding the alleged Soviet detention of American prisoners never completely disappeared. For the families of those soldiers, the issue was never about politics. It was about bringing loved ones home. If even one American prisoner remained trapped behind foreign borders, Patton believed action was required. That conviction defined him until the very end. Today, more than 80 years later, his legacy remains larger than life. To supporters, he was a fearless warrior who refused to compromise. To critics, he was a commander whose boldness sometimes created unnecessary risks. But even his opponents rarely questioned his courage. As for the showdown with Stalin, the debates continue. Some details remain disputed, some claims remain controversial, and some questions may never be answered with complete certainty. Yet the story endures because it captures something timeless. The moment when one determined commander refused to stay silent. The moment when thousands of missing soldiers became impossible to ignore. And the moment when the alliance that won World War II began to fracture before the world's eyes. In the end, George Patton's greatest weapon was never a tank, a pistol, or an army. It was his willingness to confront powerful people when he believed American lives were at stake. And whether history judges him right or wrong, that reputation has survived far longer than any battlefield victory. Because legends are not remembered for playing it safe. They are remembered for the moments when they refused to back down. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more dramatic World War II stories. And tell us in the comments, do you think Patton was ahead of his time, or did his boldness go too far? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.